All right, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to EE4210, Network Protocols and Applications. So just today we'll get started with a brief introduction to the module, and I'll also give you a highlight of what you can expect here, what we're trying to learn, the structure of the module, how we're going to organize the content, and so on. And after that, we'll get into the first lecture, which is more about introduction to computer networks. Okay. So this module has, is it too loud? I can't, it's okay? All right. So my name is Biplab Sikdar. I'm going to be the one teaching half of this module. I've been teaching this for the last, this is the 10th time I'm actually teaching this particular module. And with me, teaching the second half would be Dr. Tefek. He currently works for the ADSC, Advanced Digital Science Center, which is actually, I don't know how they do it, but it's owned by the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So they have a lab here, which is funded by the National Research Foundation, and he works there after graduating from NUS with a PhD. Okay, and then the main objective here is that you want to learn the basics of computer networks, right? So you want to learn the fundamentals, what are the basic principles, and of course we will learn real-life protocols, but the objective really is to try and understand why were those protocols designed in the way they were, right? What are the design choices? So the whole goal is that ultimately, if someday you have to make any, design your own protocol, improve something, so you know what are the fundamental principles. Of course, you can always read the standards and get the exact details of any existing protocol. That's not really the goal. We are trying to teach you why a particular protocol was designed in the way it was, right? What drove us to do it that way. And one of the things that I want to highlight here is I already got a few emails from some of you. This particular module has no prerequisites, right? But then there's another module in existence which I don't think you guys, anybody in this particular room would have done EE4204 because that was phased out a few years ago. But some of you may have done EE4204. Or you're currently also enrolled in EE4204 or thinking of enrolling, right? Now, there are historical reasons why these two modules exist, and one of them has to do with your, EE4210 is a professional development module, so it cannot have any prerequisites and so on. Now, there is a bit of overlap between, be very honest, there's a bit of overlap between this module and EE4204. But I would say that the overlap may be about in the first half-ish sort of thing, right? Maybe about 40% of the modules of the content may have some overlap. And that is because EE4210 has to be a standalone module without any prerequisites, since it's a professional development module. Now, what we will do in the first half is we will learn about things such as transport layer, network layer, data link layer, and so on. And you would probably find those topics also being covered in 4204. But subsequently, we'll move on towards multimedia, network security, right? And those are things that you will not find in 4204. So then, if you ask me, Prof, do I take this or that, right? It's your call. But if you are in the business, if your objective is to learn as many different things as possible while you're at the university, take any one of them, right? If you want to learn more and more about networks, then yeah, you can take both of them. You would probably learn something new here. Of course, my recommendation is that, you are an undergraduate, you can specialize in something, but then, the world changes and you would probably have to learn new techniques and other things. So it's good to be broad. So my own recommendation is that it's good to take one of these, unless you really want to specialize and dive deep into networks, then it's good. Any questions from anybody about Oh. All right. Okay. In terms of the textbook, this is the one that we follow. This is Computer Networks, a top-down approach. And the authors are Kurosi and Rose. Ross, sorry, not Rose. And the one that I have is the 6th edition. And I also have a 7th edition somewhere in my office. But I do believe that they have the 8th edition up there. It doesn't really matter which edition you put your hands on. They're more or less the same. There may be a little bit here and there. But any of these is good enough. Other books that you might find useful are this, Internet Working with TCP by Doug Comer. That's a reasonable book. In terms of what we will cover in the syllabus, so today is the introduction. Right? Each week has 2 lectures. So this is roughly, right? It's not written in stone that will follow exactly this 1.5, 2 weeks or whatever it is. But today is the introduction, and then on Friday we will move on to the transport layer, network layer, link layer. And that's sort of the first 4 topics are what I will cover. And then Professor Tefek will cover from 5 to 8. And those bottom 4 topics are the ones really which you will not find in 4204. Yeah, application, mobility management, multimedia, and security. And these are our learning outcomes. We want to know, what are the design principles behind some of the popular internet protocols which are out there. We want to know why certain things were designed in a way, and you want to learn the fundamentals of computer networking. That's really what it is. This is probably something you care about, how you would be assessed. So there will be 2 CA components, each worth 20%. And there's a final exam component, which is worth 60%. The final exam traditionally is closed book, but I think we do allow you to bring in a A4 sheet where you can write, type, whatever you want on both sides of the paper. The CAs, the first CA is usually something like problem solving. I'll give you a set of problems. You're going to have to find a solution to those. Maybe numerical problems, maybe something for which you have to search the web and come up with some kind of answer. The second assignment used to be programming based. So you would have to do some kind of a socket programming. I'm not sure if Professor Tefek will stick with that this year also. But, this particular module is taken by students of different backgrounds. Some like the programming part, some don't like the programming part. But I just want to give you a heads up that there will be a programming component somewhere along the lines. And if you don't like it, then consider your options. Okay. There are 2 lectures, more of logistics here. One on Wednesdays from 10 to 12, I guess. And there's one on Fridays from 4 to 6, but I don't know why this one is in LT2, the other one is in LT3, right? And I have, even though the first one says need to attend all lectures, I know you guys might be busy here and there. So all the lectures are actually being recorded. And I hope CIT folks have paid attention to my request, which says one is LT2, the other is LT3. So you would see them at some point on Canvas. So if you, for whatever reason you cannot come to lectures some days, please make sure you watch the video for the lecture. Usually I will give you tutorial problems, and the way I work is that I will give you a set of problems every week or every week and a half, and I'll give you about a week to try and solve it on your own. After that, I will solve them myself here. So there's no fixed schedule for these tutorials, but roughly, so you saw that there's a transport layer application, transport network and link layer. For each one of these, you can expect 1 or 2 tutorials. Right? So that's what we will do. Right, and this is just for all the lectures. The slides would be uploaded on Canvas. Now, I think I have already uploaded two or three sets, and then I'll upload the rest, and Professor Tefek will also do the same for his part, and similarly for tutorials. Any questions from anyone? No? All right. Okay, so now let's maybe start with a very gentle introduction to computer networks. And today my goal is really to explain some of the basic concepts and some of the terminologies that you would encounter when we talk about computer networks. Right? And in terms of technical stuff, most of this is fairly familiar to you from your day-to-day experience. But one thing I would talk about a bit in detail today is something called packet switching. Right? So that's the main goal today. All right. So let's start with the first part, which is what is the internet? Now, we all use the internet every day, right? Our lives are very, very interconnected and dependent on the existence of the internet. But if I were to just ask you, what is the internet? And I could ask this question about anything in real life. Right? I could ask, what is a transportation system? What is the postal system? What is the military? For any such question, you can answer in many ways, but let's say there are two ways of answering such a question. One is to take what is called the nuts and bolts view, and that is to say, what is the internet? The internet is made of this, 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 and this. Right? That's one way of answering that. So let's try and answer that, the nuts and bolts view of the internet. So here what we have is, if I look at what are the things that make up the internet, one are the end hosts or the end systems that connect to the internet. And that would be like my phone here, my laptop, the desktop here, maybe the servers run by Google. So these are the computers that actually want to somehow exchange data. Right? So that will be my end system or host. And these end systems or hosts run applications. Example of an application, maybe let's say email or a web browser. So these applications that are running on these end hosts, these are the ones that want to use the internet to exchange data. So one component in the internet then would be our end hosts. And in order to connect to the network, we need communication links. Right? So for example, my phone is connected to the internet right now, and it is using a communication link to connect. And right now, it just so happens that the communication link is a wireless link. I'm connected to the NUS Wi-Fi. So the link that I have is a wireless link. However, if you look at this particular machine, this computer, this is also connected to the internet, but through Ethernet or a copper cable. At home, you may have an optical fiber coming to your home. Right? So in that case, your communication link is a piece of glass, essentially. So there are many ways you could classify these communication links. It could be based on the type they are, copper, glass, wireless. You could also classify them based on the kind of data rates that they give you. How many bits per second can you transfer over them? Different links would vary in terms of their capacity. And then the third thing that we have in the internet, which as a regular user, you and I may not directly see them physically, but they play a very critical role, and those are the packet switches or routers. At some point, we will talk about the difference between what's a switch and what's a router. Okay? But their main job is to make sure that I want to connect, let's say I want to connect and send an email to my friend who lives, let's say, in California. So what happens? Let's say I type a message on my WhatsApp here, and I hit enter. The message goes from here. There should be a Wi-Fi access point somewhere along here. Maybe they've hidden it very well, but there would be somewhere in this room, right? So it goes from there. from my phone to that Wi-Fi access point. That Wi-Fi access point has a cable running, and that cable probably goes, let's say, to the NUS computer center. And then from the NUS computer center, we are actually Singtel customers, so it goes to Singtel somewhere. But ultimately, the message that I have sent has to find its way all the way to California. And even in California, maybe my friend lives in, I don't know, Palo Alto, let's say. How does it find? So essentially, when I send my message from here to the Wi-Fi access point, that access point has to make a decision. What should I do with it? The Wi-Fi access point may have only one wire coming out, so it may be an easy decision. Just send it to NUS IT. NUS IT may have only one decision to make, which is send it to Singtel. But Singtel may be connected to many different places. Singtel may have one wire going to China. It may have one wire going towards India. It may have one wire going towards Europe. It may have one wire going towards, let's say, the Americas. Which wire should my message go on? That's the job of the router or the switch. It figures out the correct path, right? So if I draw a line here, so these devices are all the routers, and their main job is that when a message comes or a packet comes in, it will have some destination that I want to go here. But if you look at any one of these routers, maybe let me erase this. Erase all. Okay. Let's say I'm sending a message, and from my home I send to this router here. This router can send on this direction, this direction, this direction. How will it do it? We'll talk about this later, but that's really the job of the routers and so on. And then the core of the network is only full of just routers. So these are some of the things or components inside the internet. And these, for the most part, are physical things that you can see and touch, except maybe the wireless link, right? But other than that, you can see and touch these components. On top of that, there is another critical thing that we require is the protocol. That's the software part of the internet. So I said I will send a message to my friend. But I cannot just write anything and expect my friend to understand or the routers in the network to understand. If I want to send a sequence of bits to some random computer in the world, and I expect that particular random computer to make sense of the string of bits that I have sent, there must be some set of rules to be followed. Okay? And those set of rules to be followed are in terms of protocols. So protocols provide a set of standardized rules to make sense or to establish a set of rules that say, okay, how do two different devices interact with each other, right? If you think about how we do in the human world, right? In the human world, if I meet you somewhere in random, we would consider it a bit rude if I just, ask you. Usually we say, hi, how are you? And then you reply, and then I ask you maybe a question that I have. In the computer world also, if you want to interact, usually there is a set of rules that you follow. So we're all on the same page, and we know how to react to the messages that we're getting. And all these are formalized in terms of protocols. Okay. In the internet world, the protocols have a funny name. It's called RFC. Okay? So some of the protocols that you have probably heard of are, for example, TCP. TCP is a protocol. And if you want to find you want to read the protocol, you Google RFC for TCP. And it'll come out RFC 11, something like that, right? Some number. And there's a historical reason why we call protocols as RFCs. That stands for request for comments. Back in the old days, in the 70s and so on, when things were being developed, it was only a handful of people, right? And somebody may have developed something, somebody else may have developed something, and I want to know, why did you do this? How is this working? So the way we would do is we'd send a message saying, can you please comment on this part of the thing? And all these answers that people got historically over time, they were compiled together, and that became a protocol specification standard. So the names stuck around, and now we call them RFCs, or requests for comments. And there's this organization called IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, and that body's job is standardization. So if tomorrow you come up with a new protocol and you want to standardize, expect to spend many, many years, many visits to IETF meetings and so on, and then ultimately it'll get standardized. Right, so we talked about this. Okay, so that's sort of the nuts, that's sort of the nuts and bolts view of the internet, which says, what is the internet? Internet consists of hosts, cables or media that connects them, and then switches and protocols. That's one way of answering the question. The other way to answer this question about what is the internet is to say, what does the internet do for you, right? That's one way of describing what is the internet. And what the internet does is it basically it provides an infrastructure to applications to exchange data. If you develop an application and that application needs to exchange data between two computers or two devices, what the internet does is it provides you with the infrastructure to do this for you. You just provide the data that you want to transfer to the internet. The internet will make sure that it reaches your destination. Something like the postal service. What does the postal service do? It takes your letters or parcels and delivers it to the destination. That's one way of describing the postal service. There's a similar thing for the internet. It can take the data that you want to transfer, and it'll do that job for you. And the way it does it is it provides a programming interface, an API in some ways, right? We give you a set of well-defined APIs, and you can use those APIs to transfer the data for you. And later on, when we'll talk about sockets and so on and socket programming, you will see how you can use these APIs that are provided that are part of all standard operating systems, and then you can transfer your data through those. All right, so now that we have had a brief look at what is the internet and components, so maybe now we zoom a little bit in and look at the structure of things in a little bit more detail, right? Now, if you look at the organization of the internet, you can break it into two distinct regions. One we will call the edge, the other is the core. Right? So let's look at the edge and the core in a bit. So if you look at a figure like this that we had drawn earlier, so here we have different examples. So here we have a scenario where you're outside, maybe outside your home, and maybe you can use your cellular phones or Wi-Fi or whatever it is to connect to the network. Then this is a typical home scenario where maybe Singtel StarHub M1, they provide you with the cable, and then you have a modem at home, and then you set up a router, Wi-Fi access point, and then you access the internet through that, right? And at the very bottom, you have something that resembles NUS or an enterprise. Here we have a mix of Wi-Fi that is provided to you. And in my office, for example, I have Ethernet and I can connect directly. So all of these, where the customers sit and they access the internet, this part, this is what we would call the edge, the network edge. And the other part, which I have not shaded, where all the routers are, those are the parts that belong to the likes of Singtel, StarHub, and M1. And it only consists of just routers. That is the network core. Okay? So another way of thinking is all the data that is generated to be exchanged is generated at the edge of the network. The core's job is not to create new data. Its job is only to transfer the data from one point to another point for the customers. Right? So that's the distinction that we will make. And the edge of the network, again, consists of hosts and the media and the media that they would use to connect. So hosts of the clients, would be like phones, laptops, and so on, and even data centers and so on. They're also at the edge, and you would consider them as clients. And in terms of the access network and the physical media, they can again be wired, wireless links, and so on. And the network core is just an interconnection of routers. So just to take a little bit of look, I'm sure you're sort of familiar with these things. If I ask you how do you connect to the internet, how do hosts connect to the internet, they would connect using access networks. So at your home, you have set up an access network which consists of leasing a cable from Singtel StarHub M1, setting up a modem and then a Wi-Fi access point and so on. So that's your home access network. Here, NUS has set up the Wi-Fi and the cables and so on. This is an enterprise access network. For this, for me, it's Singtel. Singtel has set up a 4G, 5G, 3G, whatever it is, access network. So there are different kinds of these access networks. Different access networks, again, would differ in terms of what kind of services they can provide you. And that may be how much data rate you can get, what kind of messages you can exchange, and so on. So let's take a very quick look at this, but maybe I'll just start off with the kind of media. We already talked about this. In terms of media, you can divide it into two groups, what we call guided media and unguided media. Guided media, when you transfer a bit, it goes from one point to exactly one point. How? So for example, if you have a wire, you transfer a bit from one end of the wire, it will go to the other end of the wire. If you have an optical fiber, you transfer a bit from this side, it will go to the other end of the fiber. So that's guided. So any wires, cables, optical fibers, these are examples of guided media. Unguided media, anything that is usually wireless. So when this guy transmits, let's say Wi-Fi, let's assume that is the Wi-Fi access point. So of course it goes there, but it also goes everywhere, right? It's omnidirectional. So that's unguided media. So wireless links usually tend to be unguided. But again, even with wireless, you can have directional antennas and so on, so they can be to some extent guided. But in general, wireless are the ones that are unguided. And again, even the guided media, such as a copper cable, you can have many, many different versions. So just the example that I have is of Ethernet cable. Ethernet cables come in very different categories and shapes and sizes. And some may be capable of transferring 10 megabits per second, some may be doing 100 Mbps, 1 Gbps, 10 Gbps, and so on. So they can vary. How about the access networks, right? And maybe again a little bit of history here, right? So back in the internet really probably started in the 70s and the 80s. But back then, the only users of the internet were either in the defense forces or universities or some big organizations, maybe IBM and things like that, right? Regular people did not have internet connections in their homes. The whole thing changed early 90s. And one of the big reasons that thing changed was somebody by the name of Tim Berners-Lee invented something called HTTP, which you use every day. And we'll talk about that later maybe. But what that made was, HTTP made it very, very easy for regular people to access information and visualize and see that thing, right? So anyway, so in the mid-90s, internet started becoming popular and people realized that they can use the internet to access information, entertainment, and various services. So there was a demand for having internet access at home. And in those days, Wi-Fi didn't exist, and cellular phones were in the early 90s was 2G. 2G doesn't have any data, it's only voice calls. Okay. So people wanted to access the internet from their homes, so then what do? You say, okay, I can always bring a cable to your home and then you can use that wire to transfer your data. That's very expensive. And in most developed countries, it's not the cable that is expensive. It's the labor associated with, for example, in Singapore, you don't see any cables on the air, right? Everything is underground. So digging up, laying the cable, bringing that cable to every home is very, very expensive. So what do? You try to find other solutions. So back in the day, people used to have landline telephones, right? You'd pick up, dial, and things like that. So then you think, okay, most houses, at least in developed countries, they have a telephone wire coming in their homes. Can we reuse the same wire also for the internet? Okay? And that's where this DSL started. And in DSL, the main technology is that, this is the telephone cable coming to your home, right? Earlier, this was just used for the telephone. Now, we have a modem. What this basically does is, if you look at human voice, we can hear up to 20 kilohertz, but voice is much lower. It's about 4 kilohertz or so. So the lower frequency band is used for voice, transferring voice signals. And this modem, what it does is it takes your data, shifts it into very higher frequencies, basically frequency modulation, frequency division, multiplexing or modulation, and moves it to a higher frequency. So you can use the same wire to transfer two different signals, and they don't interfere with each other because they are at different frequencies. And when the signal comes from the telephone side, you have a splitter here. And what the splitter will do is, the lower frequencies, it will direct towards your phone. The higher frequencies will go towards the modem. It's a basic idea. This was all good, except that, the telephone wires which were being used here weren't really designed for transferring high-speed data. So the data rates here were quite limited. But at least, you got your basic internet access. So as the demand for higher data rates increased, the next one was this cable modem-based thing. And again, people said, all right, telephone, yeah, we can access the internet through this, but the data rates are not high. What else can we do? Again, in the developed world and the Western world, another piece of wire that many homes had coming into them was the cable connection for their TV, for cable TV. And again, the same idea is being used. You have different frequency bands that are being used for your channels, TV channels, and then we use a different frequency band for transferring the data. Okay? But the way, because of the construction of the coaxial cable, they are capable of transferring data at much higher rates because it's better shielded against noise and other things, right? So we don't want to get into that. So that's one. There's a bit of a difference between this and the telephone-based thing is that if you look at the telephone, I'm sorry, not this guy. If you look at this, every house had its own cable coming from the telephone company to their home. That wire you didn't share with anyone. Okay? So you have a connection, that's just yours. Whatever data rate is possible on that connection is just yours. Nobody else will have that. However, if you look at the way this cable modem thing is, the cable that comes in and brings you your TV channels, that cable is shared by everybody in your neighborhood. So StarHub or Singtel's cable comes to your, whatever, maybe your dormitory or your HDB or your condo or wherever you live. Every one of your neighbors is actually using the same cable for watching their TV. And if they have a cable modem-based internet access, you're using the same wire to transfer your data and their data. And of course, there's a finite capacity on that wire, right? So if you are somebody who, students, when I was your age, I would stay up late. So if you're accessing the internet at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., you'll find pretty good rates. But if you do it at 8 p.m., when everybody is home and maybe everybody is doing something on the internet, you will see that the data rates that you get are actually much lower than other times because you're sharing with everybody. Anyway, so this is just the same thing I was saying. Some of the frequencies you use for your TV channels and some of the other frequencies you use for your data. And then another thing here was, when we exchange data on the internet, we do it two ways. We download some, we upload some. Right? So when you send an email, you're uploading. Or back in the day there was no Facebook, but let's say you're doing Facebook, so maybe you guys do don't do Facebook, you do Instagram or whatever. But if you're uploading a picture, you're sending data from your device to the internet. Most of the time we download. We upload much lesser. So the way these things were organized, where the data rates that you would get on the download were higher, and fewer channels were used for uploading. But these days there is not so much of a distinction, but yeah. All right, so this is just some details about that. And this is something you have seen. This is your typical home, I guess. So you have a cable coming in. In Singapore, this morning I was trying to look up, what fraction of homes in Singapore use optical fibers now. I got some number, but that didn't make sense to me because it was saying 1.4 million, fiber connections. Then I looked up how many households are there in Singapore. It said 1.3 million households. So that means, another 100,000 or something may have gone to, workplaces and things like that. But I don't think every household in Singapore uses cable. But anyway, I couldn't find the data. But for most cases, I do believe that now we are using optical fiber. So a fiber like this would come to your home, right? And then you would have some kind of a modem here. Could be a cable, DSL, or an optical modem. And this guy's job would be to, in the case of an optical fiber, would be, when I'm going towards Singtel StarHub, I'm sending light. But inside my network, here on this side, everything is electrical. So it converts from electrical bits to optical bits. Let's say in the case of an optical fiber example. And then this modem would be followed by your router. And most of us, we have Wi-Fi. We basically use Wi-Fi at home. So then that would be followed by a Wi-Fi access point. And in many cases, these days I've seen is that the router and the Wi-Fi, they're the same box physically. Sometimes they can be separate also. And then you would connect to the internet through this Wi-Fi. And I remember going out, I live in this neighborhood. So for me, the closest sort of thing is Clementi, right? So now I would go walk around around the Clementi Mall, Singtel StarHub M1 would stop and say, oh, you want a 1 Gbps, 2 Gbps connection to your home? Sure. So you have this, which is going to do 1 Gbps for you. Even here you can get 1 Gbps. But then I access everything on the internet through my laptop, let's say, and my phone, which is using this Wi-Fi. What is the data rate on the Wi-Fi? 56 Mbps. So the maximum I get here is 56. So it does not matter what is this 1 Gbps here, right? So I always found it a bit amusing that I'm buying this 1 Gbps link, but I will never be sending at more than 56 Mbps. Of course, if I use an Ethernet cable and I directly connect using an Ethernet cable to my switch, then I can get higher data rates. And if you're into gaming and other things, probably that's what you should do. But if you're using Wi-Fi and then you may have an optical fiber with 2 Gbps, no use. But anyway. All right. And this is something, sorry, what an enterprise like NUS would look like. Again, we would get a cable from, let's say, Singtel or StarHub, and this would come in and terminate at a router in our IT office, right? Computer center or IT building. And from there, we would have wires going to different parts of the campus. One will come to engineering, something will go to SOC, something will go to medicine, dentistry, and all those, right? And within the buildings, again, you may have, this picture just shows one particular router, but it's fairly complicated, right? So there is a wire coming from IT building to engineering. From there, we are spreading wires to every building. There's a router in every building, and from that particular router, we would have routers in every floor of that building. And that router in every floor of that building would spread out to Wi-Fi access points along the corridors, right? So there's a multi-level hierarchy, but this is something. And many enterprises such as NUS would also run, for example, their web servers and their email servers and so on. We would also have that as part of the infrastructure. And then the last one is about, wireless access wireless access networks. So you have seen the one at home. The other one, which is increasingly common, is the one using your phones. And in this case, what you would do is you would use your phone to connect to a cellular base station using a wireless link. And then the cellular base station would use optical fibers typically to take you to the rest of the internet. So this was a very, very, whirlwind tour of access points and some of the technologies and other things. Any questions from anybody about anything? Curious about something maybe I didn't cover, or you have a question? No? All right. Great. So now let's come to the core of the network. Right? And the things in the red here, they are basically the core of the network. And their job is to make sure that your data moves from the right place. They send your data in the right direction so that it reaches the destination. Now, the way you would organize your core, you have two choices. Either you could do something called circuit switching, or you could do something called packet switching. Let's first drop down and see why what is this switching thing talking about, right? So we are like, I don't know how many are here, let's say 70, 80 people. And we are all using the same Wi-Fi to connect to the NUS network. And from our Wi-Fi access point, all our data is going to use the same wire to go to IT. So we're going to share that. How do we share? What should be the rules for sharing? Okay. So that's where this circuit switching and packet switching comes in. Basically tells how we share the resources of the network. In packet switching, things are a little bit flexible. In circuit switching, it's a bit more rigid, but it also has some advantages. So let's talk about packet switching and see what we need to do in packet switching. So let's say this is my laptop, right? And let's say I have a wire connecting me to a router. So this is router, and maybe this is connected to another router, and maybe this is the server that I want to go to. And maybe this is somebody else. They're also connected here. Okay. Let's say I want to upload a picture or a small video, let's say. This is the file that I want to transfer. Let's say this is about, I don't know, 10 MB. If you want bytes, let's do bytes. I want to send this send this file to the server. So in packet switching, what we do is we don't send the whole thing in one go. What I will do is I will break up this particular big file, which is 10 MB, into smaller pieces. Okay. Now here, please allow me, since I'm not going to make 10,000 or 20,000 different pieces. Just for illustration, I have made whatever 5 or 6 pieces. Each one of them is what I call a packet. Okay? And what I will do is I will take the first packet and send it. And that packet, after some time, will reach the router. The router and its memory. A router is nothing but a computer with many different links coming. That's one you can think. So this is the memory of the router. It's going to store my packet here. So it will first wait for the whole packet to come in. It will store it in the router. And when I'm sending the packet, of course, I wanted to send my video, right? But it's not just the AVI or MPEG file that I send. Because just sending MPEG file doesn't tell the router where it needs to go. In addition to each one of these, I have to add some extra information. There's a special name for this extra information. It's called the header. What would it contain? It would contain things like, what is the destination? Where does it want to go? Facebook.com maybe, or Google something. It may also have information about the sender. And many other things, right? Basically metadata so that the network can do its job. So each of these packets will also have, this is the real data and the header. So the router will store the whole packet. Once it has stored the whole packet, it will look at the header. And so, where do you want to go? What is the destination? It says our destination is, later on we will talk about how we represent destinations through something called IP addresses. But basically it will look up the destination address. So this is where you want to go. In my diagram here, I had only one cable going out of router 1. But let's say there are other routers it's connected to. You want to go to this particular server. Should I send it here, here, or here? The router needs to make a decision. Right? So the router runs something called a routing protocol. And one example of that routing protocol, which you may have heard of, is called IP. Right? IP is a routing protocol, for example. And later on, we will also look at some of these routing protocols, how they're implemented, how they work, and so on. So basically, it will look at the destination address where this particular packet wants to go, and it will select whether I should send to R3, R2, or R4. And then it will, let's say the routing protocol says you need to go to R2. It's going to send, let's say I call it P1. This was P1. It will send P1 here, packet 1. And then this router will receive this, and it will store packet 1 here. And then router 1 is done with packet 1, okay? It has already sent it to R2. Then it can erase it from the memory, it can delete it. But this whole action is what is called store and forward. So what it did is, it got the packet, it kept it in its memory, looked at where it wants to go, ran its routing protocol, and then it forwarded it in the right direction. Okay? And then every router which gets the packet does the same thing. Stores it in the memory. Then it will see, okay, where do you want to go? The destination address will say, I need to go to this particular server. So then it's going to send packet 1 here. And the server is going to store packet 1 in its memory. Okay. Now, after my laptop has sent packet 1, after some time or immediately afterwards, depending on the protocol and so on, next it will send packet 2. Then it will send packet 3. Then it will send packet 4, and so on. And similarly, at different times, we would have packet 2, packet 3, packet 4 in the memory. And then this will also at some point send packet 2, packet 3, and so on. So one by one, sequentially. And at the destination, we will put all of these together. And finally, let's say it's up to packet, I don't know, make up something, packet 100. Finally, when packet 100 comes in, I'm going to reassemble all of these into a single MPEG file or AVI file or whatever it is. And once it has been fully reassembled into the original file that you wanted to transfer, something.avi, let's say, now it will be given to whatever application that wanted to use it. Okay. So this is the one of the basic things. Now let's make it a little bit more complicated. So here it was just me who was sending something, right? But now we have another guy, maybe my neighbor in the corridor along my office, and let's say she also has something to send. So she wants to send a file of her own. That particular file is also going to be broken down into pieces, right? And her computer will be sending packets one by one. So it may be that, I am not coordinating with my neighbor. She sends her own packets, I send my own packet. So it may be that the router got packet 1 and packet 2 from me, then my neighbor's packet 1. Right? So at the router's memory, packets from different sources can be interleaved. That's fine. Right? And maybe after this, my neighbor's packet 2 is there. Then maybe my neighbor's packet 3 came in. And then maybe my packet 5 came in, the green one. Right, so that's possible, and that's fine. And this is one way of showing how we are sharing. So, and if let's say my neighbor is also sending to the same server, so it may be that after packet 1, after the 2 green packets, it's the red packet which was sent out in sequence. Most routers will do a first come, first serve. whichever packet came first, that will be sent out, and then the next, and the next, and the next. Right? So this is packet switching, everybody is sharing. There is no well, you could do priority, but in this case, the router just deals with packets as and when they come in. Now let's take things a bit more further, right? This is the cable between R1 and R2, let's say. You could say, oh, I have an optical fiber, whatever. But no matter what you have, it's a finite capacity. It has a finite capacity, right? Let's say this particular link can do bits, bytes, whatever you want to do, 1 Gbps. There may be many users connected to that router. If you go along the corridors, you see so many staff offices. So many people may be connected to that router. They may all be sending their packets. Right? Maybe I'm sending at, 100 Mbps. Maybe my neighbor was sending at 500 Mbps. So total would be 600. That's still less than 1 Gbps, so it's okay. But if these two guys come in and they start sending 200 and 300, so now here I have 1.1 Gbps. This whole data rate here is 1.1 Gbps. So this router is getting more data than it can send out. So what's going to happen? Every packet that comes in needs to be stored in the memory, right? And again, this is a computer, so it has a finite amount of memory. You could splurge, you could spend a lot of money, buy a lot of memory for that router, but no matter what, it's finite. And at some point, the buffer or the memory will be full. Because you cannot take out as fast as things are coming in, right? You can only take out at 1 Gbps, but things are coming in at 1.1 Gbps. So at some point, this memory is going to become full. And then what? Any new packet that comes in, the router has no space. So, router is going to throw it away. Your data is lost. Okay? So when your buffer becomes full, let's say this is all full now, and if a new packet comes in, there is no more space, router cannot store it. In that case, you have packet loss. That's one. And also, if you look at this particular packet, this green packet P5, it came in, and when it joined the queue at the router, there are all these red and green packets in front of it. So it has to wait for those packets to be transmitted before it gets its own chance. Right? It's like when you join the queue for the canteen, let's say. You join the queue, you see 5 other people or 10 other people, packets in front of you. By the time you get your food, by the time you get transmitted, you have to wait for the other packets to be transmitted. So there is also a delay. Right? So packet switching comes with delays, and occasionally you may also get packet losses. So what should we do when it comes, if I lose my packet? Next week, when we talk about transport layer, we will see that it's up to you. Do you care about that packet or you don't care about that packet? If you're listening to a comment, if you're watching a live broadcast of let's say the World Cup final, if you lose one packet, maybe you don't care. It's just a small glitch in the audio or the video. It's okay. But if it's your credit card number maybe you care. So depending upon how important the data is, what kind of application you're running, you may choose to recover lost packets, or you may choose to ignore lost packets. And when we talk about transfer protocols, you will see that there are different choices of transfer protocols that you have, where you will either recover your losses or you'll just ignore them. The delay. For some applications, delay may be important. For others, it may not be. If I'm sending an email to my friend in California at this time, and maybe it's still late evening there, but if I'm sending an email, 5 milliseconds, even 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, that doesn't matter. Whether your email reaches exactly at 11:03 or 11:04, it's probably the same. It's okay. But if you're on the phone, right, if I'm doing a WhatsApp call or whatever, I forget the Chinese app's name. WeChat, yeah. Right? So if you're doing that, if you're calling on the phone and you say something and then the other side is waiting for, then the conversation is not spontaneous, and then we humans don't like it. So later on in this module, when we talk about multimedia, we will see what kind of support we can give from the network to minimize these delays, to make sure there's a bound on the delay that you get from the network. Okay. Questions? Okay. The other thing that you would see here is that in terms of performance, for every packet here that my laptop was sending, it had to traverse this particular wire, then this wire, then this wire. Right? So we call it had to go 3 hops. Right? And in every hop, later on, I don't think we will get there today, it's 11:05. When we talk about the performance, one of the things that we care about is the total transmission time. How long does it take for your data to go from one end to the other end? And there are many different components there. But one is something called the transmission time. That says how long does it take to transmit your data, right, from your side till it reaches the other side. In this case, you have to transmit your data 3 times. One is you have to transfer the data from your laptop to the wire that connects you to R1. How much time does it take? It depends on what is the data rate of this particular cable. If let's say this was 54 Mbps, just make up something, and let's say each of your packets was 1000 bits. So transmission time is packet size divided by data rate. Sorry, I should just, right. So in this case, your packet size is 1000 bits divided by 10 to the 6. And that will be your transmission time. But then this router also has to transmit from this end to this end. So this particular router is going to take 1000 bits, and since I wrote 1 Gbps here, 1 into 10 to the 9. And similarly, we have to do a transmission here. And there will be some data rate here. Let's say this is, I don't know, 500 So here it will be 1000 divided by 10 to the 6. So ultimately we will have to add all of these, right? So that will be the total transmission time. And this is not the only thing. We will see there is something called propagation time. There will be some processing time. There will be some queuing delays and so on. So we'll talk about that maybe next class. Again, that's the thing at the bottom, the transmission time that I was talking about. And these are things I've talked about, and this is the part about packets going to the router and them being stored. And if the incoming rate is much higher than the outgoing rate, then you can have queuing and then you can have loss. All right. So that's packet switching. So what's my other alternatives, right? You can say, Prof, I don't want this loss. I don't want delays. I don't want to wait in line. So if you go to a restaurant and you don't want to wait in line, what do? You're going to have to make a reservation, right? So that's the other choice you have in a network. If you don't want to do packet switching, which comes with losses and delays, what you can do is you can do circuit switching. And in circuit switching, the network will reserve resources for you. And nobody else will be able to touch it. So when you send data, there are things already set aside for you. Your data will be sent. And your data will not experience any losses, because if you've done your homework right, you would have said, I'm going to transmit 1 Mbps, please set aside 1 Mbps for me. So no losses and no delays for you. And usually what would happen is, so let's say I want to transmit from my machine here to this guy here. Before I start transmitting the data, I will have to do a reservation, which means I will send a message to the first router, say, oh, I'm going to be transmitting data at 1 Mbps. Can you help me? And this is the destination. The router will say, okay, the next guy I need to go is this router. It will send a request here saying we need to reserve 1 Mbps. So if the total here is 10 Mbps, let's say, it will set aside 1 Mbps for me. Then the same message will be propagated to the next router, and between them, they will set aside 1 Mbps for me. And then finally, it will go to the destination, and let's say the destination will also be able to set aside 1 Mbps for me. After this whole reservation has been done, then a confirmation message will go all the way back to the source, and now your circuit has been set up. Now that your circuit has been set up, now you can begin transmitting the data. Okay? And historically, before, maybe 20 years ago, the telephone systems in the world used to work like this. Maybe you guys are too young to have ever experienced that. Back in the day, if I wanted to make a phone call, let's say, even within the country, or let's say from the US to my parents in India, I would dial and then I would hear toot, 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 toot. And then that's basically different switches along the way trying to reserve a circuit for me so I can talk. Once the entire thing is done, then the phone would start ringing and then I can talk. The good thing here is your resources are your resources. Nobody else gets to touch them. So no losses, no delays. Right? But let's say I have set up this 1 Mbps link for myself. And I want to read my email, let's say. What happens when you read your email, right? Let's say you read your email from Gmail. You connect to Gmail, you authenticate, and then it shows you the page with all the emails. Some are spam, some you want to ignore, some you want to read. When you click on one of those emails, you get the email. Then you're reading it. While you're reading it, you're not transferring anything on the internet. So your connection is idle essentially, right? But the resources are still set aside for you. Nobody else is touching it. So in a way, it's inefficient. It doesn't make the best use of resources in the world. But, I have set aside for you, you're willing to pay, fine. So it's, you get performance, but you pay some price for it. And when I talk about setting aside resources, there are many ways you could set aside resources. One is, I can set aside resources in terms of frequency or in terms of time. Let's say I have a cable. What I could do is I could break it up into different frequencies. Or let's say I have a wireless channel. I could break it up into different frequency bands. You want to reserve something? I will reserve one frequency band for you. User number 2 comes in. I reserve one frequency band for user 2. User 3 comes in. I reserve something for user 3. So let's say I have 4 users. I have set aside a different frequency band for each user. Each user can transmit anytime. Free to transfer. There is no problem because you're transmitting on different frequencies so they don't interfere with each other. This is just one example of how I could do reservation of resources for people. And this particular one is called frequency division multiplexing. Probably you've seen earlier in your second year, third year things. The other option that I have is to split in time. I say, when you transmit, take the whole frequency band. I'm not confining you to a specific frequency band. Take the whole thing. But you cannot transmit at all times. So I'm going to divide time into slots, and I will allocate different slots to different people. So allocate the first slot to the blue person, and after 4 units, again blue, and so on. So you get repetition of slots, so you can still transfer, but you don't get to transfer at all times. So here I have divided my resources in time. If you look at it, you're still getting 1/4 of the entire resources. It's just the mechanism how I'm giving it to you. So this is time division multiplexing. Okay. And now you could come and ask the question, which one is better? Is TDM better or frequency division is circuit switching better or packet switching better? The answer is there's no clear answer. It depends on what you want. Right? If I just look from the perspective of how many users your network can support. Right? Let's take an example. Right? Let's say I have a system like this. There are many users, and they're all connecting to the router. And the outgoing link from the router is 1 Mbps. Okay? And if you look at the user, each user, like I was talking in terms of the email, most user activity you can think in terms of on, off, on, off. You download a little bit, you read, you watch, whatever, and then you go again. Okay? So it's a active, inactive kind of pattern. And let's say in this example, a user is active. That means they're transferring data only 10% of the time. And that's a fairly accurate number. 10 to 20% of the time is when we are active, when we're in the network. Right? If you're reading a news, you go to straitstimes.com, you click on a news story, it downloads, then you're reading. While you're reading the news, you're not using the network, you're idle at the time. Right? So let's say you're idle 10% of the time. And again, these things are random, right? It's not that you read for 1 second, you download for 1 second, then you wait 9 seconds. It's random, but on an average, 10% of the time you're active, 90% of the time you're inactive. So now I can ask you the question, how many users can you support in circuit switching and in packet switching? So in circuit switching, when the first user comes in, it says, okay, when the user is active, he or she needs 100 kilobits per second, right? So user 1 comes in, I reserve something for you. How much? 100 kilobits per second. Now, whether you're active, inactive, I've reserved it for you, nobody else can touch it. Right? So I'm only left with 900 Mbps. So user 2 comes in, I set aside another 100, and so on. So how many users can I do? 1 Mbps divided by 100 kbps, which is 10 users. So circuit switching is easy. I can only support 10 users. Because activity, inactivity doesn't matter. When you're active, you need 100. I don't know when you will be active, so I have to keep things aside for you anyway. So I can do 10 users. What about packet switching? Right? In packet switching, things are a little bit more complicated. Each user is active with probability 0.1, right? 10% of the time. And you're inactive with probability 1 minus p, which is 0.9. Right? And now, when I am active, doesn't mean you necessarily have to be active at the same time. When I make a phone call, you don't also make a phone call at the same time. We all make phone calls at random times. So now it's a probabilistic thing. So I could ask you, if you have 100 people, what is the probability that 10 people are active at the same time? Or 20 people are active at the same time? Right? So if you think about this, each person is active or inactive randomly with probability this. If I said 10 people, what is the probability that 5 people are active at the same time? If you remember your probability, it's a binomial distribution. Right? So if I have, let's say, n users in total, what is the probability that k users are active? Right? This is n choose k, p to the k, 1 minus p to the n minus k. By the way, we are not going to be doing this kind of problems in this module. This is just to illustrate, make my point here. Okay? So, if there are 10 or more users, then I get into trouble. Right? If there are 10 or more, if there are more than 10 active users, then I get into trouble because I don't have enough for them. If it is 1 active user, 2 active users, no problem. So I get into trouble if there are more than 10 active users. What is the probability that there are more than 10 active users? That is 11 active users, 12 active users, 13 active users, 14 active users, and so on. Right, this. So P we already know is 0.1. This is what? 0.9. So now I can play with different values of n and see what I'm comfortable with, right? And now if I go back here to my HDMI, it says that if I choose n equals 35, even if I have 35 users, the probability of more than 10, if I put n equals 35 in that expression and ask a computer to do this for me, you will see that that probability is 0.0004. So it's very, very unlikely that there'll be more than 10 people active at the same time. So usually the answer is circuit switching can handle more users. And most networks, even your cellular network, your phone network, is based on this kind of principle. No disrespect to M1, but let's say we are all Singtel StarHub customers here, right? In NUS. 30,000 students. So 15,000 Singtel, 15,000 StarHub. And let's say within engineering, I don't know how many students, actually I know how many students, but let's say within engineering there are 2,000 Singtel customers here, let's say. We are all connected to the same base station, Singtel base station. How many calls can that handle? Usually about 200. But there are 2,000 customers connected to the same base station. But it's okay because I'm not making a call, right? You're not making calls. If more than 200 people make a call at the same time, then we will be unhappy. But the probability of that happening is very, very low. And most base stations and so on are designed knowing this real life fact that the probability that many, many people will call at the same time is pretty low. And I've been here 10 years in Singapore. There has been only once that I tried to make a call and I was unable to because all the resources in the network was busy. And that happened on a Sunday afternoon at the Bugis Mall. And there were lots of people, I don't know why they were, I don't know why I was there too, but I didn't have any specific reason. But, occasionally things get crowded and then you may not make it. But if that happens to me once in 10 years, I'm okay. I don't mind. If it happens every day, then I'm unhappy. So as an engineer, as a designer, this would be your guideline. You design your system such that this particular probability is pretty low. As long as you design accordingly, then you're fine. Questions? No? Okay. So this is sort of the conclusion of all this which we're talking about. So if you ask me which one is better, is it circuit switching or packet switching? There's no answer. Depends on what you want. If for you say, no, I will not have any losses, I will not have any delay, go for circuit switching. If your goal is to have a system that's cheap, but for most of the time it can support users, no problem, you go for packet switching. So it depends on so on. If you cannot tolerate losses and so on, you go for circuit switching. But then, the basic fact is now everything is packet switching based. Historically, the data part, the internet part was packet switching. But the telephone part, the phone, voice conversations were circuit switching. Even with cellular networks, till 2G, things were circuit switching based. 3G also to start with. And traditional wired telephones were always circuit switched. But now, of course, the data part of the internet was always packet switched. Even now, all the voice has switched over to packet switching. So circuit switching is sort of, at least in the commercial world, in the day-to-day commercial activities, circuit switching is not used. It's all packet switch based. Questions? Yeah.
Is there a packet size standard?
There is. So the question is there a packet size standard? And the answer is no, there is no packet size standards. Different protocols require different packets for different jobs. So you will see the smallest packet size would be about 40 bytes or so. And then, all right. Most of the protocols will put an upper bound on the packet size. And that upper bound tends to be about 2,000 bytes, 2048 or something, because it's a power of 2. Why do we have an upper bound on the packet size? The reason is, in the old days at least, when we were transmitting data on cables and so on, things were very noisy. So you transmit a 1, there is always a probability that because of noise, you will misinterpret it and you'll think it's a 0. It doesn't happen so much on wired stuff, coaxial cables and so on, or optical fibers, but with wireless things, it's very common. Wireless links are very, very susceptible to noise. So you're at home doing Wi-Fi, using the Wi-Fi network, and your roommate comes in and turns on the microwave, right? It's going to interfere with your thing. You stay next to the highway or next to the road. Not an electric vehicle, but an internal combustion engine one, truck or a bus goes by. The spark plugs, they will interfere with your transmission. So if your packets are very large, the probability that there will be an error goes high. If it's a small packet, then the probability is small. So based on that, they would usually come up with a bound, say, okay, with this packet size, I expect my error rates to be low enough. So the upper bound on packet sizes is usually about 2,000 bytes. But later on, when we will see is, you send data, and you expect the other side to tell you whether they have received the data correctly or not. So those packets are usually 40 bytes, and data most of the time is 1,400 bytes. Most data packets. Maybe about 50-60% of data packets would be that. And then there are usual sizes like 200 bytes, 500 some bytes, and so on. Other questions? By the way, feel free to interrupt me at any point, okay? You don't have to be formal and say, I'm going to wait till the end. And of course, you can wait till the end, no issues there, but feel free to ask questions at any point you like. Nope? Right, then I think it's a good time for us to stop here today. And Friday, LT3, okay, across the bridge towards Central Library.